All right, let's talk about the American gold rush. You know that picture in your head? The one with the grizzled prospector finding a giant nugget? Well, what if I told you that classic story is barely even the beginning? The real story is so much bigger, darker, and way more complicated. Let's get into it.
Yeah, you know the image I'm talking about, right? That lone 49er knee-deep in a river, sloshing a pan around, and boom, a huge gold nugget. It's the ultimate American dream story, all about grit and getting rich quick. But here's the thing, was it really like that? Oh, not even a little bit. That whole myth of a simple adventure, the reality was a brutal, global, industrial-scale free-for-all. I mean, we're talking about a story that's really about state-sponsored genocide, a permanent poisoning of the land, and the rise of huge corporations on the backs of all those failed prospectors. It's a whole different ballgame.
So to really get what the gold rush was about, we've got to look past that classic 49er myth. This was never just an American story. From the absolute get-go, it was a worldwide event.
And just look at the numbers here. They tell a really surprising story. We think of the 49ers as all American, but a full third of them were immigrants. People came from literally all over the world. Hawaii, Mexico, China, Europe, turning California into this incredibly chaotic and, yeah, often really violent global frontier.
And here's something you probably didn't learn in history class. Because news traveled so slowly back then, the first international miners to show up weren't from the East Coast. They were from Chile. They got there in late 1848, and they brought with them years of real mining experience and way better tools, like a special wooden gold pan that was way more effective than anything the Americans had.
But being better at the job just sparked this intense resentment. American gangs started attacking the Chilean part of San Francisco, and that violence spilled over into the gold fields in what's now known as the Chile War of 1849. When the Chileans tried to get the law involved, local judges just flat out refused to help them. It all ended with the public execution and whipping of several Chilean miners.
A couple of years later, another huge wave of immigrants arrived. More than 20,000 people from China came over by 1852, fleeing problems back home. They had a name for California, Gamsan, which means Gold Mountain. And they earned this reputation for being incredibly persistent, working claims that other miners had given up on as completely worthless. And you guessed it, their success also led to a massive backlash. The state created something called the Foreign Miners Tax, which was basically just a tool to push Chinese and Latin American miners out. And then it got even worse. The California Supreme Court ruled that Chinese people couldn't testify against white citizens in court, which pretty much made it impossible to get justice for theft or violence. Now, as horrific as all that was, the gold rush saved its most brutal and systematic destruction for the people who were already there, the native Californians.
Just look at these numbers. Before the rush, in 1846, there were about 150,000 indigenous people in California. Just over 20 years later, by 1870, that number had crashed to 30,000. That's an 80% drop. And this wasn't some accident or a byproduct of disease. It was a planned state-sponsored genocide.
And I'm not exaggerating, this was official government policy. This is a direct quote from California's very first governor, Peter Burnett. In 1851, he stood up and called for a war of extermination. That was the stated goal of the new state government. And they actually built an economic system to make this happen. A state law, can you believe it, made it legal to capture native people and sell them into forced labor. The government itself paid out over $1 million, which was a fortune back then, to private militias who were basically just Indian hunters. And some towns even paid bounties for body parts, $5 for a head, 25 cents for a scalp. The horrifying takeaway here is that the genocide wasn't just legal, it was profitable.
So the human cost was just astronomical. But the gold rush also physically changed California's landscape in ways that are hard to even wrap your head around, leaving a legacy we are literally still dealing with today.
Let's look at San Francisco, for example. It's just a wild story. So thousands of sailors get there, and what do? They just ditch their ships and run off to find gold. So you've got hundreds of ships just sitting in the cove. And since there weren't really any buildings, people got creative. They turned these ships into hotels, stores, even the city's first jail. Then, get this, to make more land, they just started sinking the ships on purpose and filling in the area around them. San Francisco's foundation is literally built on top of a ghost fleet of buried ships.
And they are still down there right now. The skeleton of the Niantic, which used to be a hotel, is buried near the Transamerica Pyramid. The Euphemia, that first jail, is somewhere under the financial district. And when they were building a transit tunnel, workers literally just dug right through the hull of a buried ship called the Rome.
So while the ships were getting buried, something way more dangerous was being poured into the rivers. Miners used an estimated 10 million pounds of mercury to separate gold dust from dirt. A massive amount of that toxic metal just washed away. And it's still there today, poisoning California's water and wildlife.
You know, the scale of the environmental destruction is just staggering. By the 1850s, a new technique called hydraulic mining was invented. They used these massive water cannons to literally blast entire mountainsides into rubble. To put it in perspective, this process washed enough debris into the rivers to equal 8 times the amount of earth they moved to build the entire Panama Canal. It caused insane flooding and buried huge swaths of farmland.
Okay, so if the land was getting destroyed, and most miners were broke and facing violence, who was actually getting rich? Well, turns out that dream of striking it rich was just that, a dream, for pretty much everyone who actually dug for gold.
See, in the very early days, in 1848, a super lucky miner might have made about $20 a day. But just 4 years later, with hundreds of thousands of people competing for what little gold was left, the average pay had crashed to just $6 a day. And after you paid for your ridiculously overpriced food and tools, you were lucky to break even.
So who were the real winners? Well, it wasn't the guys with the pans and pickaxes. Nope, it was the people selling stuff to them. There's this saying, during a gold rush, sell shovels. And that's exactly what happened. A guy named Samuel Brandon became a millionaire selling supplies. You've heard of Levi Strauss, right? He got his start selling tough denim pants to miners. And those household names, Wells and Fargo, Folgers Coffee, they all built their fortunes by servicing this massive influx of people.
And here's a part of the story that almost nobody talks about. After the gold started to run out, California's economy completely reinvented itself. The state's next big thing was the wheat rush. By the 1860s, California had become a global farming powerhouse, shipping huge amounts of grain to Europe, often on the same ships that had brought the gold seekers in the first place.
And kind of ironically, it was the battle between these two new industries, mining and farming, that created another unexpected legacy. In 1884, farmers finally sued the big hydraulic mining companies for destroying their land. And in a huge decision, a judge named Lorenzo Sawyer actually sided with the farmers. It basically shut down hydraulic mining, and in the process, created one of the very first cornerstones of American environmental law.
So when you really step back and look at it, the gold rush kind of set the DNA for modern California, didn't it? It's this strange mix of incredible, relentless innovation and opportunity, but it's built right alongside ruthless exploitation and a real winner-take-all kind of economy. And that really makes you think, from Silicon Valley to Hollywood, how much of that original gold rush spirit is still alive and kicking today.
Thank you so much for joining us to dig into the real story of the gold rush. If you learned something new today, we'd really appreciate it if you hit that like button, let us know what you think in the comments, and of course, subscribe to InfoNow for more deep dives like this. We'll see you in the next one.